The fairground building in Miller's Fork smelled like church coffee and wet flannel, and 40 exhausted farmers sat in crooked rows of folding chairs doing math that did not come out right. By the third week of August the blight had gone through 3 counties field by field, and the ears that looked fine from the road had kernels gone gray and soft underneath, dusted with a chalky mold nobody wanted to name out loud. Josiah Whittaker stood at the podium in a pressed shirt that had never once touched a cornfield and told the room what they already suspected. Whittaker Distilling would not take blighted grain this season. Not at a discount. Not at any price. For generations, he said. And they had not gotten their cutting corners on the grain. Nobody argued with him. He bought most of the corn in the county most years, and there was a bank note due in October attached to nearly every man in that room. It was Diane McAllister who stood up near the back, 60 years old, arms crossed. "I'll buy it," she said. The room went quiet the way a room goes quiet right before it decides to laugh. Whittaker obliged them. "You're going to buy the blighted corn," he said. "With what, Diane? Bob's mushroom money?" It got the laugh he wanted. Diane did not flinch. She had been married to Bob McAllister for 30-some years and had long since stopped being embarrassed by what other people found funny about him. By the end of that week she had driven the gravel roads of 3 townships with cash in an envelope, and the McAllister barn was stacked to the rafters with $4,000 of corn that Whittaker Distilling would not touch, bought with most of what was left in a savings account that had never been thick to begin with. Miller's Fork had a new favorite joke that week, courtesy of Josiah Whittaker. The mushroom man's wife had finally lost it completely.
Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from. Now let's begin.
Miller's Fork, Kentucky, sat in the kind of valley where the good bottomland belonged to the same 3 families it had belonged to for 4 generations, and Whittaker Distilling had run its bourbon out of the same limestone water spring since before anyone currently living could remember it being built. Josiah Whittaker had inherited a name, a reputation, and a habit of confusing the two. Bob McAllister had inherited nothing of the kind. He was 63, a retired rural mail carrier who had spent 30 years driving the same gravel routes past the same mailboxes, and every fall for 30 of those years he had dragged Diane out into the hardwood stands behind their property hunting morels and chanterelles. Filling one spiral notebook after another with pencil sketches of fungi that most people in Miller's Fork would not have looked at twice. The town found him harmless. A little ridiculous. The kind of man who got more excited about a shelf fungus growing out of a dead oak than he ever did about high school football, which in that part of Kentucky was saying something. Diane had met him on one of those walks, back when she was younger, talked into it on a dare from a girlfriend who expected her to be bored senseless by mid-afternoon. Instead she had spent 3 hours laughing at how completely delighted a grown man could get over something nobody else in the world would have bothered to notice. She had not married him because she expected the hobby to be useful someday. She had married him because paying that kind of attention to an ignored thing was, in its own quiet way, the most romantic habit she had ever seen in a person. That evening after the meeting, Diane sat at the kitchen table and did the arithmetic on what was left in the account, a little over $6,000, most of it Bob's pension money and the last of a small inheritance neither of them had touched. She decided how much of it she was willing to lose. The next morning she started driving the county, offering neighbors cash for corn that Whittaker Distilling had already refused. Most of them thought she had lost her mind. A dozen of them, desperate enough not to care why, sold anyway, and by the end of the week the barn held roughly 400 bushels nobody else in 3 counties wanted, what nobody in that fairground building understood, what even Diane did not fully understand yet, watching Bob turn an ear of blighted corn slowly under the kitchen lamp that same night, was that she had not married a fool. She had married the one man in 3 counties who might actually know what he was looking at. Bob sat with the corn a long time that night. Long enough that Diane finally asked if he planned to eat it or just stare at it until morning. He did not answer right away. That, more than anything, was what made her put down her coffee and actually pay attention. "I've seen this before," he said finally. Not on corn. On logs. For 30 years Bob had catalogued fungi the way some men catalog coins, patiently and for no reason beyond his own satisfaction. Buried in his notebooks were pages devoted to molds he had found on rotting hardwood, some common, some rare enough that he had mailed samples to a mycology professor 2 hours away just to be sure. One family of those molds, close kin to strains used for centuries in traditional fermentation elsewhere in the world. The same broad family behind soy sauce and aged cheese, broke down starches in a way Bob had found endlessly interesting and, until that night, entirely useless. "This isn't the toxic kind," he told her, tapping the gray bloom on the kernel. "This is close kin to something I've had samples of for 15 years. It doesn't ruin what it's growing on. It changes it. Most people never learn to see the difference, because most people never look close enough to need to." "You think you can turn this into whiskey?" Diane said. It was not really a question. "I think," Bob said slowly, "that Whitaker just threw away the one thing that might make the best batch this county's tasted in 50 years. Nobody's ever tried it, because nobody who knew corn ever bothered to learn mushrooms, and nobody who knew mushrooms ever had a reason to learn corn. Until now. They cleared half the barn for fermentation tanks bought secondhand off a hobbyist upstate, and Bob spent 2 weeks working from his notebooks, adjusting temperature and timing with the same patient attention he had once spent identifying a single bracket fungus, now aimed at something with a bank note attached to it. The first test batch, run on a fraction of the corn, came off the still on a Tuesday evening in early September. Diane stood in the barn doorway while Bob nosed the jar and watched his face change the way it had a handful of times in 30 years of marriage, the exact look he wore standing over a mushroom he had never found before. "Come smell this," he said quietly. It smelled like nothing either of them had made in that barn before. Warm and rich, caramel and something close to toasted bread, none of the rough edge Bob's hobbyist friend upstate had warned them to expect from a first run. It was not finished whiskey. It was 3 weeks and a lot of barrel time short of that. But it was unmistakably something. "That's not luck," Bob said, mostly to himself. "That's 30 years of paying attention finally landing on something worth paying for." Diane laughed for the first time in weeks, standing in a barn full of corn the whole town said she had wasted her savings on, and for a moment it felt like Whitaker had made his joke about the wrong family. The good feeling from that first batch did not survive the next 2 attempts, which Bob later admitted was a fair kind of humbling. Identifying a fungus on a log at his own pace was one problem. Controlling that same fungus in a tank, at scale, with corn they could not afford to replace, was an entirely different one. The second batch overheated 2 nights early in a warm spell, the fermentation racing ahead of itself before Bob caught it. $300 of corn and 2 weeks of work. Gone in a single overnight swing. The third attempt undercorrected the other way, too cautious, stalling before the fungus had finished its work. Between the 2 failures they were down to less than half the corn Diane had bought, with nothing finished to show for it, and the $4,000 in the barn had become, by Diane's count, closer to $2,200 of usable product at best. "We can't afford a 4th mistake," Diane said one night, not unkindly, just honestly. Bob did not argue. That was almost worse. Bob McAllister not arguing meant Bob McAllister was scared, and in 30 years she had rarely seen that particular side of him. Word travels in a county the size of Miller's Fork whether anyone wants it to. And Josiah Whitaker heard soon enough, through channels he never bothered to disguise, that the McAllisters were cooking something up. He did not come himself. He worked 3 angles at once, the way a man does when he has more leverage than any one problem requires. The first was a young county surveyor, polite and apologetic, claiming a routine check on a property line that had not needed checking in 11 years. The surveyor walked the fence exactly as long as it took to get a clear look at the tanks through the open barn door, then left within the hour. Diane watched him go with the tired clarity of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize reconnaissance wearing a friendlier coat. The second was quieter. 2 of the farmers who had sold Diane their blighted corn found themselves, within the month, informed by a Whittaker distilling buyer that their clean grain would be graded a shade more strictly than usual come harvest. Nothing was said outright. Nothing needed to be. The third arrived by mail, an anonymous letter to the county health office, raising a concern about an unlicensed still operation running out of a residential barn on the McAllister property. It was not illegal, what Bob was doing, not yet, not at the scale of a hobby experiment, but it was exactly the kind of complaint that got a county inspector out to a farm within the week, notebook in hand, asking questions Bob did not yet have good answers for. It was not all bad news that stretch, and it was the small wins, sparse as they were, that kept the two of them from quitting outright. Curtis Boone, who had spent 31 years on the Whittaker still floor before his knees gave out, stopped by under the pretense of borrowing a socket wrench Bob did not actually have. Diane poured him 2 fingers from what was left of the good batch. Curtis rolled it in the glass a long time, tasted it, and set the glass down slow. "Don't tell anybody I said this," he said, "but you two have got something here." He left without borrowing the wrench. A week later Patsy Combs, who ran a diner in the next town, asked quietly whether the McAllisters might have a few bottles to spare once things were legal to sell. And a stranger drove nearly 2 hours on nothing but a rumor heard at a feed store, tasted a pour off the second good batch, and drove home smiling. Small as they were, those moments were the only thing keeping Bob upright when, 2 weeks after the surveyor walked the fence line, the Millers Fork County Harvest Board announced an emergency session. The agenda item at the top of the sheet had Diane's stomach dropping before she finished reading it. A proposed ordinance requiring all blighted grain, countywide, to be destroyed rather than processed. Retroactive to the start of the season. The Harvest Board met in the same fairground building, folding chairs, a hand-lettered sign taped over the basketball schedule. A reporter from the county paper sat in the second row, and word had gotten around enough that the room was fuller than any Harvest Board meeting Diane could remember. The proposed language did not name the McAllisters. It did not have to. Blighted grain, countywide, destroyed under county supervision, effective immediately, no exception for grain already in process. Everyone in the room, including the board, understood exactly whose barn this was written to shut down. Josiah Whittaker sat in the front row that night. Arms crossed, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. He had been to enough county meetings to know that the most effective lobbying was often the kind that never got written down. The vote was 5-2. Diane sat in her folding chair and felt the whole barn, $4,000, 2 lost batches, 30 years of notebooks, collapse into something that suddenly felt very much like Whittaker's joke had been right all along. It was Elton Pruitt who spoke up as the room started to empty. He farmed 200 acres on the north side of the county, and 3 years earlier, when a blight of a different kind had wiped out half his own tobacco crop, it had been Bob McAllister, a man with no formal training and no reason to help, who had spent 2 unpaid afternoons walking Elton's fields with him, helping him identify which stands could still be saved. Elton had never forgotten it, and he had voted against the ordinance from his seat at the table for exactly that reason. "Hold on," he said, loud enough to stop people mid-step toward the doors. "I don't like voting to shut down a family operation on rumor and a survey walk. If the McAllisters believe they've got something real here, something safe, something documented, I'd want to see that before I call it settled for good." He looked at the board chair. "We'll reopen this for one more hearing. Next Tuesday. If anybody can produce real documentation, real testing, something beyond a good story, this board owes it to the county to hear it before we make this permanent." It was not a win. It was 6 days and a chance, and 6 days and a chance was more than Diane had walked in expecting to leave with. The strain that followed was the real kind, not the manufactured kind. Bob sat up most of that first night at the kitchen table, and when Diane came down for water at 2 in the morning she found him with his head in his hands. Not working, just sitting. "Everybody's always laughed at this," he said, not looking up. "The mushrooms. The notebooks. I let them laugh because it never cost anything. Now it's going to cost us the farm, and I'm supposed to walk into that building Tuesday and convince 5 people who've never once taken me seriously. Diane sat down across from him. You've spent 30 years being right about things nobody bothered to check, she said. You don't get to lose your nerve now, 6 days before somebody finally has to check. 6 days is not much time to build a case for a county board, and Bob and Diane spent every hour of it like the whole farm depended on how it was used, because it did. Bob called the mycology professor 2 hours away, the same one he had mailed samples to for 15 years out of nothing but curiosity, and for the first time in a decade and a half of friendly correspondence, asked for something that actually mattered. Dr. Ellen Whitfield drove out 2 days later, toured the barn, reviewed 15 years of notebooks stacked on the kitchen table, and ran a battery of tests on the fungus and the finished product in a rented lab space in town. This is remarkable documentation, she told them, flipping through one notebook after another, dates going back further than either of the McAllister children had been out of grade school. Most amateur naturalists don't keep records this careful. Most professionals don't either, honestly. 30 years of nobody asking me to stop, Bob said, and for the first time since the vote something like his old dry humor crept back into his voice. Curtis Boone came back out on his own, openly this time, and offered to put his 31 years at Whitaker Distilling on the record. Patsy Combs sent word she would testify to the customer interest she had already fielded on rumor alone. The stranger who had driven 2 hours wrote a letter, unprompted, describing exactly what he had found. None of it felt like enough, some nights. Diane lay awake doing the math on what happened if Tuesday went the way the first vote had, the barn, the savings, the marriage that had never needed a crisis to prove itself now facing one anyway. But every morning she got up, made the coffee, and sat back down across from Bob and his notebooks, because quitting with 2 days left had never once been the plan. Dr. Whitfield's results came back the Sunday before the hearing. Clean. Safe. Precisely the fungal strain Bob had identified from his own field notes, present in the developmental stage he had described, producing the flavor compounds his years of observation had led him to expect. Not luck. Not a fluke. You realize, Dr. Whitfield told him, packing up her equipment that Sunday evening, that what you've documented here is genuinely useful to people who study this for a living. This isn't a hobby anymore, Bob. It never should have only been one. Monday night, the night before the hearing, Diane found Bob on the porch after dark, one of his oldest notebooks open on his knee, her own handwriting still in the margin from the very first mushroom walk she had ever gone on with him. She sat down beside him without saying anything. Whatever happens tomorrow, Bob said quietly, none of this exists if you hadn't gone along on a dare 30 years ago and decided to keep coming back. I didn't come back for the mushrooms, Diane said, leaning her head against his shoulder. I came back because you were the only person I ever met who looked at something everybody else ignored and thought it deserved a closer look. Tomorrow's just the first time the rest of the county gets to find that out too. The fairground building was fuller for the second hearing than Diane had ever seen it, folding chairs dragged in from the church basement, a stringer from the county seat television station set up near the back beside the newspaper reporter. Josiah Whitaker sat in the same front row seat, arms crossed, though something in his posture that night looked less like confidence than it had 6 days earlier. The board chair called for evidence. Bob stood up, and 30 years of being gently humored rather than taken seriously stood up right along with him. He did not perform. He was not built for performing, and he did not try to become someone else for the occasion. He opened his oldest notebook to a page dated 11 years back and explained. In the same plain, patient voice he had used identifying fungi in the woods for 3 decades, exactly what the mold was, why it behaved the way it did, and how 15 years of samples mailed 2 hours away had led, eventually, to a barn full of corn nobody else in the county had wanted. He walked the board through Dr. Whitfield's results page by page, answering every question without raising his voice once. Then Diane stood and did the thing she had planned all along. She had brought bottles, unlabeled, and glasses enough for the board and the front 2 rows, and she poured the finished whiskey blind, no story attached, and asked each person in the room to taste it before they voted on whether it deserved to exist. Whitaker took his glass the way a man takes something faintly ridiculous, humoring the room the way he had humored Diane's stand weeks earlier. He drank. Something crossed his face that every person in that building saw, because he was not a man practiced at hiding it, surprise first, and then the particular discomfort of watching the thing he had mocked in public turn out to be better than the thing his own family's name had rested on for 4 generations. The board chair asked him directly whether he had any comment on the sample. Whitaker opened his mouth to say something dismissive and found, in front of a room that now included a television camera, that there was nothing dismissive left to say that would not make him look exactly like what he was. He set the glass down without finishing the sentence he had started. The ordinance died in committee that night, 4-3. Elton Pruitt voted the way he had promised, 2 others swayed by evidence instead of rumor, and the McAllisters walked out of the fairground building the way they had walked in 6 days earlier, together, unhurried. The line for miles came the following spring. Once word had properly spread and the first legal bottles hit the shelves of Patsy Combs's diner and a handful of stores across 3 counties. Cars parked along the gravel road on weekends, people driving from 2 counties over to see the barn where it started and buy what they could before it sold out. Curtis Boone came out of retirement to run the still floor on his own terms. 2 of the farmers who had sold Diane their blighted corn that first desperate week came back on the payroll full-time, to keep up with an order book that had outgrown the barn twice already. Bob McAllister, the man Miller's Fork had spent 30 years finding harmless and a little ridiculous, ended up teaching an informal Saturday class out at the farm for anyone curious enough to ask. His old notebooks passed around a folding table the same way they had once sat ignored on a kitchen counter. Nobody laughed at them anymore. A few people asked to make copies. On one of those Saturdays, a boy no older than 8, son of one of the newly hired farmhands, tugged on Bob's sleeve while the grown-ups talked business over glasses they were not old enough to drink from. "Mr. McAllister," the boy said. "Can I come look for mushrooms with you sometime? Like you used to, before all this?" Bob crouched down to the boy's level, the way he had crouched over 1,000 logs and stumps across 30 years of walks nobody thought were worth taking. "Only if you're willing to notice what everybody else walks past," he said. "That's the whole trick. Always has been." That evening, once the last car had pulled off the gravel road, Diane and Bob sat on the same porch they had sat on the night before the hearing. The barn lights off, the whole place finally quiet. "Well," Diane said, nudging his shoulder with hers. "Your mushroom obsession finally paid off." Bob smiled the way he had smiled at her on that very first walk 30-some years earlier. "You married me for exactly this," he said. "You just had to wait 30 years for the rest of the county to catch up." Nobody in Miller's Fork ever thought Bob McAllister's strange little hobby was good for anything, until the one year it saved them all. Sometimes the thing everyone laughs about is the thing worth paying attention to.